Spirit of life and love, holy mystery. How do we pray for hope? How do we bow down or look up or sit in silence or walk among the trees to make hope come alive when it feels so far beyond our grasp? We breathe. We look within. We listen. We reach out. We hold in the depths of our heart that knowing that hope is a gift we cannot destroy. It is the heartbeat always stirring within us. It is the imagination awakening us to possibility. It is the unfolding of faith in action. May we hold on to hope and carry it for one another and for this broken and hurting world. May we be vessels of hope. May we be proclaimers of justice. May we be demanders of accountability and responsibility. May we be catalysts for equality. Throughout every word and deed, may love prevail. Then and only then, may we achieve true healing. In the name of all that is holy, we pray. Amen, and may it be so. And let's be in silent meditation for about a minute. And if you'd like to, you can focus on your breath in and out. And I'll end with a bell. Well, we've all heard Dr. Martin Luther King, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. speak, and we know how moving his speech is, and really, I don't know if anybody else has been blessed with the combination of gifts that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had. The rhetorical skills, his eloquence, his deeply held theology of loving even one's enemies, his courage, his drive, and his unwavering commitment to the goal of freedom. But he also had vision. He had the imagination to envision a future in which Black people and all people would be free from the shackles of unjust laws and inequality. This combination of gifts enabled Dr. King to motivate hundreds of thousands of people to join in the fight for civil rights. And I don't mean to imply that King single-handedly led the civil rights movement. There is a tendency to create a reductionist narrative. One that says, as the professor and activist Julian Bond quips, Rosa sat down, Martin stood up, and then the white folks saw the light and saved the day. Yeah, we know it wasn't quite like that. We know there were thousands of leaders involved in this movement, but King's vision helped carry the movement forward, and the message, "We shall overcome," that he repeats over and over in this short speech. It became a powerful rallying cry for the fight to win freedom. After the civil rights movement had achieved the ending of legal segregation and the enactment of the Voting Rights Act, King wrote a book called Where Do We Go From Here? He laid out his vision for the next phase of the civil rights movement. And so, the civil rights movement achieved so much, and then he had a vision for the next phase. So he laid out that vision in this book, Where Do We Go From Here? Focusing on jobs and housing and education. And he had a plan for eradicating poverty. He envisioned how Americans could lead the way to end global suffering. Today, many of us are asking the same question King asked in 1967. Where do we go from here? Right? Yeah. Because right now the new administration is taking aim at multiple groups of marginalized people through a confusing explosion of new, harmful, discriminatory executive orders, at least 45 of them so far. It's an onslaught unlike anything we've ever seen. Racism, transphobia, xenophobia, and other oppressive attitudes and the policies that emerge from them, they're all connected. I'd like to continue to look at racism right now because if we can understand the dynamics involved in racism, we can understand all of it. And from there, we can make more informed choices about where we do go from here. I've done extensive work to educate myself about racism, and I continue to do so. I have slaveholder ancestors, and this knowledge of my family history has led me in this direction. As I was planning this service, I'd been thinking about some of my reading. Books like My Grandmother's Hands by trauma expert Resmaa Menakem. Menakem, who is Black, shows us how the history of this country has produced intergenerational trauma in Black people. And he shows us how white supremacy culture has also traumatized white people in different but also very harmful ways. White supremacy is internalized deep within our bodies, whatever our race. And through fear-mongering, we've all taken in negative images of Black people, especially Black men. So I was going to focus on how these images affect us and the pain and the harm that they've caused. And then I rewatched a video of a talk given by Ibram X. Kendi, and I was reminded of the work that he's done on understanding the roots of racism. And so what I want to focus on this morning is how these images get into our minds and who's putting them there and for what reason. Kendi reminded me that we tend to think of racism as a result of ignorance. Before he wrote the book, Stamped from the Beginning, anybody read that? Yeah, I really highly recommend it. Kendi studied over 600 years of racist ideas. He said that he actually began his research thinking that, quote, the root of the problem of racism is ignorance. That people just don't know about Black people, and that's why they've been creating these racist ideas. And as he got into his research and writing, he realized there was a critical difference between the people who were creating these ideas and the people who were consuming the racist ideas. So you have people like Thomas Jefferson. Was he racist because he was ignorant? Kendi says Jefferson didn't hate Black people. He says Jefferson loved Black people. You know how much Jefferson loved Black people. End quote. Jefferson claimed that history was a hideous blot. Yet he enslaved over 600 people. and he wrote that blacks were inferior as a race. You have people like John C. Calhoun, a U.S. Senator from South Carolina and a graduate of Yale. Calhoun, in 1837, stood up and stated that slavery was a positive good and that it was beneficial for both enslaved people and society as a whole. Kendi investigated through centuries of racism whether or not the people creating these ideas were ignorant. He found that over and over again, on the contrary, these influential producers of ideas about black racial inferiority were some of the most brilliant minds in history. The producers of racist ideas were not creating them out of ignorance or hate. When Calhoun claimed that slavery provided the enslaved people with a stable life and that it made them more civilized, he knew full well that slavery is inherently oppressive. Now, these racist ideas emerged as a strategy to protect the self-interest of the wealthy and powerful who benefited from racism. Starting with the first promoters of black enslavement in the 1500s, who characterized the Africans as subhuman creatures who, quote, lived like beasts. These white men who stood to gain from subjugating black people created and disseminated these ideas to justify the racist policies they supported. The agenda of these producers of racist ideas was to implant these ideas and images into the minds of the people who were consuming the lies. What the spreading of these ideas did was to normalize racial inequities. Someone who's abusing power will say something that doesn't sound quite right, but they keep repeating it. It's a favorite tactic of abusers and fascists. What happens is it overrides people's own internal moral compass, and they then begin to accept these ideas as normal, as fact. Most white people who were consuming these ideas bought into the basic idea that there was something inherently lacking in black people. The human ego, that part of our consciousness that's tied into our survival instinct, it loves to feel like we're better than other people. And don't we humans tend to look down on people who are outside of the group that we identify with? So being told they were a member of a superior race, well, that really appealed to white people's egos. Most white people were willing to believe the lies about black inferiority, and then they helped the wealthy elite keep an entire race down. Now, we've experienced our nation as one of making racial progress, only seeing one single historical force. Kendi says he found that actually isn't accurate. He talks about how 8 years ago, many progressives were shocked that a candidate endorsed by the KKK could get elected to the presidency following the groundbreaking presidency of the first black man. We thought we'd been making racial progress toward an end to racism. And obviously there has been significant progress. For Kendi, though, the election made perfect sense. As he studied our history and its patterns, he saw that there are actually dual historical forces. Just as anti-racist forces have been making progress continuously, so have racist forces been making progress continuously. He says when people have broken through barriers, the people who put those barriers in place did not just go home and go to sleep. They erected new and more sophisticated barriers to exclude people. Kendi helps us understand that the reason anti-racism work has not triumphed over racism is that ending racism is not simply a matter of education. It's not just about teaching white people about white supremacy, about microaggressions, about helping white people overcome misconceptions about black people, as important as these things are. No, the reason anti-racism work has not eradicated racism is this: those with power are still benefiting from racism, and they will not let it go voluntarily. Those with power do not relinquish it voluntarily. We know this. And those with the most power continue to erect more sweeping and more sophisticated barriers to benefit themselves and to exclude those they deem unworthy. How are they benefiting? They benefit culturally, politically, and economically. I'm going to focus on the economic benefits for a moment. Kurdish-British philosopher Ariane Shavisi explains how racism fits into a capitalist system. The primary purpose of a racial hierarchy, she says, is to enable the subjugation and exploitation of particular groups. Racism, therefore, plays an important role in an exploitative regime like capitalism. She reminds us what capitalism actually is. She says, quote, "Capitalism is an economic system which centers on the accumulation of wealth that is used to create even greater wealth through exploitation," unquote. So if we pause for a moment and picture the world before capitalism, hunter-gatherer communities shared the resources of the earth based on what people needed. But then people went and carved up the earth and claimed ownership of everything. So then you had to work to get money and pay for anything you needed. She goes on. The amount of capital held by any person would remain static without some kind of ongoing extraction. Capital accumulation therefore depends on keeping wages much lower than the value of a person's labor and demanding payment for goods and services that exceeds their value, end quote. Seeing our racial hierarchy through the lens of capitalism, the motivations of those at the top to keep racism in place become obvious. Black people have suffered economically throughout our U.S. history by design, with white people having roughly 15 times the wealth of Black people, with more than twice the number of Black people living below the poverty line compared with white people, with the Black unemployment rate for the past 50 years twice as high as for whites. Now, if we were to ask the neoconservatives with their economic interests to protect why these disparities exist, they'd have us believe that we're living in a post-racial society. Their response would be along the lines of, there's no discrimination anymore. Therefore, the problem must be with Black people. The fact is, capitalism requires someone to remain at the bottom of the hierarchy. It requires a group whose cheap labor can be exploited. No one's labor value today is $7.50 an hour. But let's remember, the greater the exploitation, the more the accumulation of wealth. Now, if you're not making it on $7.50 an hour, or you're not contributing to the economy at all because you can't get a job due to discrimination, which, by the way, does still exist, and maybe you're desperate and you're caught doing something illegal, no, that's okay. You can be sent to a for-profit prison. If you're Black, of course, you can also end up in prison for doing nothing illegal. And in prison, they can then force you to work for little or nothing to produce goods. We used to call that slavery. 50 years ago, Dr. King believed that our economic system could be reformed and that poverty could be eliminated. But as we've seen, the rich and powerful have accumulated even more wealth and power since that time. And yes, racism has we've made progress toward the end of racism, but it's still with us because there are still benefits, economic benefits that the wealthy and powerful, mostly white men, gain from keeping the racial hierarchy in place. And political benefits. If you convince people there's something wrong with Black people, Then you can win elections by promising to address the affirmative action problem, the crime problem, the welfare problem, and cultural benefits. Cultural benefits such as the right to white comfort. And I'm going to expand this idea of white comfort now to say heteronormative, binary, cisgender, and American citizenship white comfort. These wealthy conservatives are so attached to their white comfort and preserving what they see as white cultural norms and power structures that they're willing to resort to fascist tactics to hold on to it. They're using violence and spreading vicious lies about Black and brown people, immigrants and transgender and non-binary people. They're deeply afraid of a shrinking white majority, one that conforms to their narrow definition of cultural norms. And in a twist of logic, they're limiting access to abortion as a means of demographic control. The goal is to increase white births while simultaneously increasing Black and brown maternal deaths. It's truly sick. So, where do we go from here? Well, we can withdraw into a place of fear and despair. And there's always going to be a place inside us that wants us to go there and stay there. It's important to acknowledge that. And it's important right now to take extra good care of ourselves, to take care of our spirits, to be kind to ourselves, to find joy in small moments. And remember what I said at the beginning of this talk about Dr. King, about how he used the power of his imagination to envision a way forward. Dr. King can inspire us to use our imaginations to envision our way forward now. Because we shall overcome, and I cannot say it like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But these times are different from the 1960s. But throughout history, oppressed people and their allies have worked together to overcome the powers of evil, and they've succeeded. We've succeeded. Yes, these times are different. Then if you wanted to be involved in the civil rights movement or another issue of the day, there were a handful of groups that you could affiliate with. Choosing a way to be involved was simpler. Back then, UU churches often banded together to take action. I've thought about this a lot. Some factors that made this work: highly committed membership with hundreds of families, strong volunteerism, many women who weren't in the workforce, members who were willing to rally behind the authoritarian leadership of a male authority figure. There are a few UU congregations today that still embody some of these factors, and responding to what's going on as a whole congregation is still a possibility, but it's no longer a typical thing. We tend to be diverse in our passions and how to pursue them. Social justice team, I think you're well aware of this. Yes. And today there are literally hundreds of social justice organizations that we could get involved with. It gets a little overwhelming. But we can't allow these diverse opinions and options stop us from finding an answer to the question, where do we go from here? How can we counter the onslaught of hateful policies and rhetoric that are being churned out right now? And by the way, the pace of all this is a fascist tactic. It's a well-known fascist tactic, okay? Some of you know this. It's designed to knock us off balance and to make us feel overwhelmed. And so we just can't allow the bullies to succeed in silencing us. We must continue to speak the truth, because we shall overcome. And the way we'll do it involves two things: supporting those who are affected and engaging with others to overturn unjust policies. 1, support. Probably most of us know at least someone who's being affected by these anti-trans, anti-non-binary, anti-immigrant, anti-racist, and anti-bodily autonomy policies. Connect with them. Connect with their families. If you don't personally know anyone who's being affected, find someone who does know someone and get connected. I mean, there are people right here in this congregation who need our support right now. So offer it. Offer your allyship. Ask how you can be involved. And be prepared to be transformed by the experience. I'm reminded of the words of the Australian Indigenous activist and artist Lila Watson, who said, "If you have come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come here because your liberation is bound up in mine, then let's work together." Because here's the thing, we are inextricably tied together. The act of preserving human dignity and agency, that's the core of our work in this time. Civil rights lawyer Brian Stevenson, who works to gain justice for wrongly convicted men on death row, he does a lot of other things too, but he offers this: I think sometimes when you're trying to do justice work, when you're trying to change the world, the thing to do is to get close enough to people who are falling down, to get close enough to wrap arms around them and affirm their humanity and their dignity. 2, working to overturn unjust policies. Many of us are already involved, either on our own or through a social justice organization. And if you're not and you want to be, here are some places to start. Call your legislators to register your protest. Flood their phone lines. They need to hear from us. Join the ACLU. The National ACLU is taking all kinds of action. I attended a virtual town hall meeting on Tuesday, it was. There were 13,000 people there. 13,000 people. Folks, we are not alone. And the Delaware chapter is also doing a great job of responding to what's going on. Take a training or a workshop. There's a workshop that we're going to be sponsoring. You can find information out there on the poster that was put up just this morning by Karen. We won't say anything about the wrapping paper, will we? No. Okay. And we'll also announce more about it at the end of the service. But, take a training or a workshop or, volunteer. If nothing else, sign some petitions or make a donation to support their work. A lot of people here are involved in organizations. If you want to get involved, there's lots of ways. So just pick one. We're living in very, very disturbing times right now. There's no doubt about that. But it's not hopeless, and we are not helpless. Honor your feelings, and then do something. Don't let yourself become paralyzed by fear or indecision. It's important for us to focus on positive engagement, to connect with others. And, it helps us to counter those voices of despair that some of us are struggling with. To remember that we are not alone, and every action makes a difference. We shall overcome. Will you say it with me? We shall overcome. All right. Anything else is not an option. And go out into the world in peace. Have courage. It seems like we need courage for everything, doesn't it? Yeah. So hold on to what is good and return to no person evil for evil. Strengthen the faint-hearted, support the weak, help the suffering, honor all beings